So I just wanted to thank everyone for attending today's talk. A little bit about myself. I am an assistant professor of American Studies at San Jose State University. And I would like to continue by first thanking the Buddhist Churches of America and the Center for Buddhist Education, Yumi, Judy, Carl, and everyone who has helped to organize this series of online talks, and in particular, these two back-to-back talks on the topic of looking to the future of American Buddhism. I'm going to talk a little bit more about myself later on in the introduction, but I want to go straight to the PowerPoint for time. So let me see if the technology is going to be working in my favor today. Okay, let's see. All right.
It's up.
Okay, great, perfect. Okay, I'm happy to be able to participate in this discussion regarding the future of American Buddhism, especially in partnership with the esteemed Dr. Scott Mitchell, who spoke last Saturday. And those of us who were able to attend his talk, we were presented with a really thoughtful treatment of ways that we can think about the future of American Buddhism in the plural, as he mentioned. Just one second, okay. As he mentioned in his previous talk, that there are many Buddhisms, and he also helped contribute this notion of a radical honesty and this idea that in envisioning the future, there are very much present day actions that we can be involved in to cultivate that future that we're thinking about and imagining in our minds. So I'm going to be looping back to some of those ideas later on in the talk, but I want to thank Scott for getting us off to such a strong start and helping us develop a solid foundation for thinking about this topic. My academic background, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is in American Studies and in education, actually. Prior to my academic life, I taught elementary school in Los Angeles. So I bring this context and this orientation to thinking about young people towards this conversation around the future of Buddhism. I think that we can all agree that any question and consideration about the future is invariably a question about young people. They are, in both a pragmatic and a hopeful sense, our very future. So without thinking about the question of the future of American Buddhism and what it means for young people in particular, we can risk overlooking the contributions that are going to be required of young people to manifest the ideals that we might be discussing. And moreover, we also risk overlooking their needs and what I see as our obligation to provide the conditions for their ability to lead. So to continue, I'd like to actually start this talk by looking to the future by looking to the past. And the first part of this talk, it's going to be divided into about two and a half sections. So the first section is actually going to be looking at a historical moment of potential crisis for the Buddhist Churches of America in regards to being able to conceive of a future for American Shin Buddhism. So here I'd like to be a little bit more specific and clear about how I'm situating the idea of American Buddhism. And because of the audience of today's talk, I am prioritizing the reference to American Shin Buddhism and the Buddhist Churches of America. But some of the comments that I'm making and the general trends that I'm going to be talking about in regards to religion and youth are going to be applicable to other Buddhisms and American Buddhisms as well, especially in regards to how the youth are driving those communities and future aspirations. Okay, so as I mentioned, the first talk is going to be looking to the past. I'll be examining the period of Japanese and Japanese American incarceration during World War II. And I trust that many of you have been kind of up to date with the recent work of Reverend Dr. Duncan Ryukin Williams in American Sutra and the great contribution that he's offered in retelling this history of American incarceration during World War II and locating the religious aspect of it, discussing how it wasn't simply a matter of religion, simply a matter of race, but how incarceration and exclusion was intertwined with discriminatory sentiments around religion. So I want to focus on a really small sliver of that time that Dr. Williams talks about and look at the years of 1943 and 1944 in particular to understand the threats that relocation, or often it was called resettlement, posed during those years. And that was a time period where those who were incarcerated were then asked by the War Relocation Authority, pretty much forced to, because they really had no other option, to start thinking about where it was that they were going to resituate themselves within the United States. And the idea was that they were going to be encouraged to spread across the United States. And with that spread, it posed the potential to really diminish the possibility of American Buddhism and the Shin Sangha to be able to be together and have a sort of physical presence together. So I want to look at how young Buddhists during that time period were really called to action, to think about how they could sustain and maintain their version of American Buddhism. And then I'd like to move on to talk a little bit and link back to Scott's discussion of radical honesty as a bridge to thinking about young Buddhists today and the contemporary issues that are being presented to them in their reimagining of what a future looks like and what American Buddhism looks like within that future. Okay, so I'd like to start with this article from one of the Buddhist publications by the young Buddhists, or the Busei. And this one was a special issue that was published for New Year's in 1944 from the Busei Review. And it's entitled National YBA President's Message. So in the message, we have the YBA president, the Young Buddhist Association president, Manabu Fukuda, providing an orientation to his fellow young Buddhists, or Busei, in regards to directing their trajectory in the new year within the camps. And he says, "This is the second new year since the ideals of democracy have been exploded in the face of the Japanese Americans of the West Coast. This explosion has shattered everything, including their hopes, their determination, their courage, and their ideals of life. As they enter the second year of restrictive freedom, most of them are busy trying to repair the damage inflicted upon their spiritual welfare." And though it might not seem as apparent within the language of this quote, what Fukuda is talking about is this sort of containment through racial exclusion. This notion that democracy has been exploded is one that is very much situated in this idea of inequality in the United States. So at the start of this new year, when they're bringing in the possibilities for what can happen during incarceration, for the future that exists beyond incarceration and that exists beyond the barbed wire, there is this ever-present realization of the physical and institutional structures of racial exclusion that they're being presented with. And he continues by saying, it will take strength and courage to salvage the damaged spirits of the Niseis. However, the young Buddhists should possess the necessary tools with which to continue and succeed in the grave operations of the spiritual salvation. And I put young Buddhists in bold because I really wanted to highlight how it was the young people who shouldered the efforts and the responsibility and the obligation for maintaining this organization, the Buddhist Churches of America, and also for manifesting the future of American Buddhism during this time period. So the youth had a central role to take in determining the continuation of Shin Buddhism.
I love it so much. The Blazers, great first half so far. They lead the Clippers 75-69.
I think there's a little bit of audio feedback. We can get everyone.
Yes. Will everyone please mute themselves? There's someone who's not muted. So I'm sorry, Funie.
Oh, that's okay. There we go. Perfect. All right. Okay, so I wanted to stress this argument that the young Buddhists were essential in the future of American Shin Buddhism. And it's not just because they were the upcoming generation. So it wasn't simply a matter of practicality. But it was because of these continuous and ever-present frameworks of race and exclusion that also required that they step up and serve as the new leadership to really drive the direction of Shin Buddhism in America. And here I want to highlight a quote from the Busse Review. And again, I'm pulling from these newsletters and these publications that were created in the camps, across the different camps, by the Buddhist youth. And in this article, entitled Reports by Buddhist Churches of America from 1944 in the Busse Review, we get a little bit of a taste of how race and exclusion figured in the everyday lives of young Buddhists. And here in this quote, it says, "We are advising you in regards to the Buddhist churches." So this is a report to the young Buddhists, "which you left behind on the West Coast. Realizing the fact that we do not know what is in store for the buildings that are left behind, we must comply with the alien land law in every respect. We find it most urgent that each church appoint board of directors and empower this board to act upon any church problems needing immediate attention so that various church problems can be undertaken by said board. This board must naturally be a Nisei board." And so I highlighted this phrase, the alien land law, to demonstrate the very direct and specific ways that ideas of race were incorporated into the institutions that the young Buddhists had to maneuver around, not just within incarceration, but even before the period and beyond the physical location of incarceration, that structure their lives. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the alien land law, there are a series of laws that were enacted in California starting from 1913, which were directed towards all those who were not citizens or known as aliens. And it restricted their ability to lease or own land in California. So you can imagine that this had a significant impact on Japanese and Japanese American. And indeed, even though the law wasn't directed explicitly towards Japanese, I should say, not Japanese Americans, it was in fact intended to have a very strong negative impact on that community. And it was intended as a way to kind of curtail Japanese immigration and the establishment of Japanese communities in the United States, the growth of these communities, and the very future of these communities within the United States. So here in this report, what is really striking is the fact that young Buddhists are really called to action, to be the leaders, to be the literal board members, to take on the charge of the Buddhist churches of America because they were the American born, because the alien land law pertained only to aliens. So primarily to those Issei who were aliens, who were not citizens of the United States. The Nisei, the American born Japanese Americans, had the constitutional rights and the citizenship rights that would afford them the ability to then do things like sign leases, to own land, to have titles transferred under their names. And so in this regard, they had to step up and become the leadership in the future of American Buddhism. And I would like to say too, my experience, as I mentioned earlier, is in teaching elementary school. So I really would be quite happy to hear questions along the way. I envision this as kind of a conversation and discussion more than a formal talk. And especially because I'm prioritizing and focusing on youth, I would really welcome any comments or questions by young people. I don't want to simply set myself aside as somebody that is an expert on young people. I can no longer justify calling myself a young person. I think I need to get used to that fact. And so I don't want to come across as presenting authoritative views on what their perspectives are today. So I would really love any questions along the way or comments. So keep that in mind. I'm going to move on by talking a little bit about some of the strategies that emerged in these conversations that were presented in the various Busei bulletins, Busei reviews, etc., across the camps that were written by the Buddhist youth during the time period. And again, I'm focusing on this period of 1943 and 1944 because that's really when the War Relocation Authority commenced their campaign for the resettlement of the incarcerated Japanese and Japanese Americans. And it posed a quite existential threat to the possibility and consideration of sustaining American Shin Buddhism. So some of the strategies that they utilized, and I'm kind of categorizing these strategies into 4 big categories, included faith in the Dharma and really pulling from Dharmic knowledge, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path. You would often see these being referenced in the very articles in the bulletins and the Busei reviews. For example, here we have the president of the Manzanar Young Buddhist Association discussing in the Manzanar Busei Guide in 1943 and discussing some of the trials and tribulations that the young Buddhists and Japanese Americans had to endure during their time, and demonstrating a way that they relied on their faith as part of their strategy for continuing and preserving American Buddhism, American Shin Buddhism into the future. So here he notes that during the past year of evacuation, we recalled in our solemnity that Buddhism has been proven true during our trying days. It has taught us to gain the highest perfection with patience and perseverance. This faith is a great gift in guiding our future life and making it important for us to seek and learn, more so the enlightening and compassionate teachings of our Lord Buddha. So we have faith as a driving factor. And in the writings of the Busei across the camps, of course, the practice of Nembutsu was the predominant way of expressing that faith. Another strategy that they used for cultivating their efforts in maintaining American Shin Buddhism for the future was being highly organized and focusing on this ability to strengthen their organizational skills around the structures of the Buddhist Churches of America, but also subcommittees that formed within the camps as well. So one of the examples that I'm going to highlight in the next slide is this article from the Denson Buddhist Bulletin in 1943 that was entitled "The Need for Headquarters." But before I get to that, I also wanted to point out that these bulletins themselves were a very clear and direct and tangible demonstration of the ways that the highly organized capacity and motivations and efforts of the young Buddhists in the camps really led to the ability for them to not just cohere their Sangha after the initial relocation and placement into the incarceration camps, but then to think about how they would do that when right in the moment where they're feeling some sort of stability in 1943, everything gets shattered again, and they're forced to think about resettlement and relocation across the United States, how they're able to cultivate the ability to sustain their efforts and communicate with each other through these bulletins. Okay, so I want to get to then this example that I mentioned in the previous slide, need for headquarters, as a demonstration of the organizational strategy. And here, again, this is an example from the Denson Buddhist Bulletin from October 3rd, 1943. And the quote says, "The question is now before us, fellow Busei, whether we want Buddhism to survive in these United States or not. The time has come when the future Buddhism does lie in our hands. With so many Busei leaders and members relocating, the need has risen for a workable headquarters on the outside world for those who are out of these centers to be in constant contact." And so one of the ways that they approach dealing with the scattering of Buddhists across the United States, which they saw as both a challenge and also a possibility for spreading the Dharma, for propagating the Dharma into corners of the US that they might not have envisioned prior to incarceration, was by having a physical building. And I recall in looking at some of the questions that were submitted earlier on by some of the attendees who registered, there was a question about whether in the future of American Buddhism, physical buildings would be needed. And so it makes me think about this quote, because in this circumstance, when American Shin Buddhism could have very much kind of terminated with the end of, terminated with the commencement of relocation, the priority and the sense for a need of a physical headquarters was really essential for the young Buddhists during that time period. And they found it as a way to create a sort of grounding for the members who would be not just moved and scattered across the United States, but for those who were also stationed and drafted in the war, who were serving in places like the Pacific or in Europe, et cetera, et cetera. So again, we had the strategies from the earlier slide of Dharma, organization, and the third strategy I found was leadership. And I think that in the few examples that we looked at today, so far, we can definitely see evidence of this strong leadership. To further highlight this aspect of the strategies for moving forward in American Shin Buddhism, I'm drawing from the Topaz Busei Life this time, a May 15, 1943 article entitled "Carry On Busei." And it talks briefly, this is a little bit more factual, about an event that occurred very much tied to trying to decide the future of American Buddhism. And you can see in the quote, it says, "Delegates to leave on Wednesday to decide the future of Buddhism in America. The third national 9th annual YBA conference will be held in Salt Lake City from May 20 to 23rd. And the theme is this notion of carry on Busei. So leadership, we heard from Manabu Fukuda earlier on. These young Busei really took the steps, took the initiative to situate themselves as kind of the driving agents in determining and ensuring the existence of American Shin Buddhism in the future. And they were very much aware of the precarious nature and positioning of American Buddhism and American Shin Buddhism in particular during this time period, as I mentioned, with 1943 and 1944 being this decisive period within even incarceration. And then finally, I want to focus on this last category of their ability to adapt quite quickly to change. And one of the examples of this is an additional example, I should say, because I think the leadership example right before also demonstrates this very adept ability to adjust and be flexible in regards to change. Another example is the Jerome Research and Resettled Home Program Committee. And this was a committee that was created in direct relation to the pressing issues of resettlement in 1943, 1944. And they were responsible for supplying religious material to the relocated Busse. So presented with the fact that suddenly the community that they were able to rebuild within the camps, which was already a really difficult undertaking, physically, emotionally, logistically, etc., and being presented with the fact that it was quite impermanent. And they would write about this reality using Buddhist terms like impermanence and seeing that as part of their practice. They met that with increased flexibility and motivation to adapt to the changes. And this is a primary example, the Research and Resettled Home Program Committee, of how they kind of took up that challenge and decided, well, if we're going to have to be forced to leave each other, some people being forced to move away from not just their Sangha, but family and friends, and really not having a community of Buddhists or other Japanese Americans or people who were non-white, being able to connect with them across wide geographical distances and landscapes. They decided that they were going to create this committee to send them religious material as a way to stay connected, to send them, included within these packages, copies of these bulletins so they can stay abreast of the issues that were occurring within the camps and beyond. And the Jerome Research and Resettled Home Program Committee ended up serving as a model for the other camps as well. They were the first to establish such a committee, and then really, because of the impact of their work, influenced the other Busse and other camps to take on a similar type of program. So here we have in the Denson Buddhist Bulletin, which was the Busse journal that came out of Jerome, kind of an editorial note from 1943 that demonstrates the leadership ability and the impact that the Research and Resettled Home Program Committee had. Okay, so now that we looked at some of the ways that in this historical moment, young Buddhists responded to the challenge that was presented to them, or I should say the numerous challenges that were presented to them, sort of culminating in at least my focus in this examination this morning in that period of 1943, 1944. I want to go back to one of the initial ideas that American Buddhism, both before the camps and within the camps, for all of the Buddhist practitioners residing within the camps, was very much tied to race. And that the future of American Buddhism for these young Buddhists during that time period was still intimately connected with issues of race as well. In the Busse Review from February 22nd, 1944, we see an example of the ways that considerations of race were very much on the minds of the young Buddhists. And we have a quote here from an article entitled "New Cabinet Installed as Large Crowd Enjoy Social," that discusses how Reverend Tsunoda introduced the new YBA cabinet and concluded with an inspiring sermon on the topic of race prejudice and relocation, resettlement programs for young Niseis. So even the future of American Buddhism was very much interconnected, to draw from one of the concepts that Scott Mitchell was really highlighting in his talk last week. Issues of race were intimately interconnected with the visions of American Buddhism and the future of American Shin Buddhism during this time period.
Funie,
Yes.
there's a couple of chat comments. I don't know if you noticed.
Oh, okay. I did not see them because I didn't have my chat window up, but I see them now. Okay. This might be a good time actually for me to look at some of the questions because the next bullet point takes me into the next section. So let's see.
Perhaps you can read the question out just so that, you know, everybody has that, can hear that.
Sure. So I'm going to start with Elsie Lum. And the question from Elsie is, what was the average age for the youth YBA in 1944? Right now, these youth who were interned are about 76 years old. I hope we can learn lessons that can apply to current YBA members now. The average age, I think it would be a little bit harder to calculate because the YBA and those who consider themselves part of the Busei were actually a wider age range than what we typically think about in regards to today's current YBA. I think a lot of the distinction between who was a Buddhist youth was around the generational distinction between the Issei and the Nisei. So within that range, you had people who were quite young, maybe around middle school, high school, to people who are a little bit more established in their young adulthood, who were married and had children. Manabu Fukuda, for example, he was sort of on the higher range of what would be considered a youth. So he definitely was not one of those who were in the middle school, high school range. So in that regards, it makes it a little bit more complex in thinking about what the average age was. So to reiterate, I would say that it is more expansive than what we think about for the categories of who would be considered a YBA member today in regards to age range versus a junior YBA or versus just a regular adult member of the Buddhist Churches of America. And I too hope that we can learn lessons from then that we can apply to today. And I think the last section of my talk is going to show that some of the young Buddhist youth today are very much employing these same lessons, and they might not be aware of it, but they are employing a lot of the same strategies. I'm going to take another question. I'm managing two computers, so I'm getting a little bit confused with the mechanisms for scrolling down between the two. Okay, that's not right. Let me go back to the chat. Okay, sorry. Thanks for your patience in dealing with my trying to manage these two different devices. Okay, the next question is from Reverend Kobata, I think. The Nisei youth were responding to the surrounding challenges of protecting and preserving their religious identity. Our dilemma seems to be challenges from within our, maybe that's supposed to read institution. Okay, so that's a comment, and I'm very intrigued by that comment. I would really love to hear more about that, maybe in the ending conversation where we open up to a wider discussion. And I think maybe the last part of this talk will highlight a little bit more of some issues that I suspect are related to some of the things Reverend Kopata might be hinting at in that comment.
There is a second part of that comment below.
Oh, okay, institutions, I see it, at 11:33 a.m. And being able to transition opportunities to the next generation, both traditional and convert. Ah, okay. So this is very much within an organization, organizational perspective of the Buddhist Churches of America, it sounds like. Being able to transition opportunities to the next generation, both traditional and convert. I think this is one that deserves a focused conversation. And I'd really love to hear from people who are on this talk who might be leadership and who might be part of the YBA, maybe formally or informally in regards to what their thoughts are on this issue.
So maybe that could be brought up during the Q&A.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be great. So if I forget to come back to this question in the Q&A, which I suspect that I will, somebody please remind us so we can touch back on this And I think I'm going to, for the sake of time, stop the chat conversation or addressing some of the questions and comments on the chat for now, so we can move on to the other parts, because I know you would all like to have a rest of the day. I don't think you want to spend your whole day listening to this talk. Okay, so my last bullet point tries to build the bridge to talking about contemporary issues. And so I take this argument about race and racial exclusion shaping not just American Buddhism, but also shaping the ways that young Buddhists within this particular time period of 1943 and 1944 were envisioning the future of American Shin Buddhism, and connect it to how issues of race are similarly shaping conversations about the future of Shin Buddhism today, but in different ways. But I should say, and these issues of race are very much interconnected, again, to use that term, with myriad pressing forms of suffering. So today's youth are not only thinking about the ways they need to kind of work around integrating American culture and structures within their practices of Buddhism and vice versa, but they're also thinking very deeply about the ways that issues of race are connected to other really urgent issues that are shaping their lives and their ability to conceive of a future. Okay, so this is where I want to turn to Scott's use of this term radical honesty, and I really want to thank him again for offering something that I feel is a very helpful way of thinking through the possibilities, and also, I want to stress, our obligation in cultivating a potential and the conditions for possibility for the youth in their efforts to imagine, design, and realize an American Buddhism and its future. So I want to stress and really highlight that during this time period, one of the differences between struggling with this idea of the future of American Shin Buddhism for today's young Buddhists versus in 1943 and 1944 is that we can no longer assume that there will be a future. And granted, in 1943 and 1944, some of the young Buddhists were talking about in their writings in these bulletins, this fact that they were stepping out of incarceration into what they call the dark world. They weren't sure what was going to happen. And this notion of a dark world was a reference both to World War II, but also to the racial issues that were still very much limiting the possibilities for where they could relocate in a safe way within the United States. And so in certain regards, the possibility of a future was very much questioned back then as well. Today, in the statement, I'm referring more to the physical possibility that we as a human species will be here for continued generations. That, I think, has been an assumption that many of us have taken for granted for perhaps the existence of humanity until this time period, where the young people today are dealing with the reality of an environment, a climate collapse that is threatening the ability to conceive of the possibility of having a future. So a recent report coming out of Australia noted that the possibility that there is a distinct possibility that by the year 2050, the human species would be extinct. And this possibility was linked to the warming of the planet, climate change, and human beings' own participation in creating the conditions for our own extinction. So these are some of the aspects of today's world that we, as people concerned about the future of American Buddhism and American Shin Buddhism in particular, need to be radically honest to ourselves about. And the young people of today have no choice but to be honest to themselves about these conditions. We're living in a time of COVID, and that's precisely why this talk is online. There's more and more conversation by zoologists about the fact that zoonotic diseases, that is, diseases that are transferred between non-human animals to humans, are in fact on the rise, and they have been on the rise. And scientists are talking about the fact that there will be future pandemics. This is not simply a possibility, but that just as many scientists predicted the pandemic that's happening now, maybe not necessarily the specificity of COVID-19, but predicted that there would be this widespread pandemic that's happening during this time period. This is not the only one that we're going to have to be confronted with as a human species. And so young Buddhists today, young people in general today, are living in a world where this is part of their reality. And again, these are some of the issues that we need to be radically honest to ourselves about when we think about the future of American Buddhism, and even when we think about what is at stake when we assume that there is a future to be had. And more particular to some of the issues that are facing young people today within the United States, is one that is very much on the minds of the people that I work with on an everyday basis, and that is the student loan debt crisis. So I'm presenting here a series of some of the urgent social issues that are intertwined with racial exclusion as part of this larger map of what young people and young Buddhists today need to contend with as they think about what the possibilities for a future are. So going back to this bullet point, the student loan debt crisis has ballooned to 1.6 trillion. And the data from the Federal Reserve that demonstrates this growth really is quite astonishing, because it shows from 2007 to 2020, sort of this straight diagonal line going from a lower point of student loan debt from 2007 to kind of like, if you just draw 2 points from the left-hand corner, bottom left-hand corner, to the top right-hand corner of a graph, and just drew a straight line, that is what the graph looks like of the way that the growth of student loan debt has increased over less than a 20-year period. So this is something that young Buddhists are carrying with them, and young people in general, I should say, which leads to things like rising levels of depression and anxiety among teens. And this larger social and religious and cultural context where, according to the Pew Research Center and a report issued in 2019, that those who are identifying as religiously unaffiliated, or what's often called nuns, because they identify, when they're asked on the surveys in regards to what religion they associate with, as associating with nun, that these youth are on the rise. This trend is on the rise. I believe it's something like 4 out of 10 young people identify as not being affiliated with any religious tradition. And this is an increase over even the last 40 years. So we're starting to see, as a wide trend in religious communities, young people moving away from religion. And that's happening for a number of reasons. Losing faith in authority, losing faith in formal institutions of organized religion, reasons related to politics and political identification, reasons related to economic issues that prevent young people from being able to get married at ages that historically they've been getting married at and having families. All of this is related to why more and more young people are identifying as not being associated with a religion. So this poses a concern for the question of the future of American Shin Buddhism and the future of American Buddhism. But again, going back to the notion of radical honesty, I think if we are to be honest and to start at an authentic place of considering this question of how can we look to the future of American Buddhism and conceive of one, we need to start from this place of radical honesty to understand the urgent issues that are facing young people, young Buddhists today. Because that leads us to understanding what the conditions of possibility are, or to being able to draw up and envision with young people what it could look like to have a future and what these conditions for doing that might require. A recent article from the Associated Press entitled "Faith in Protest as Young People Find Fervor on the Street" demonstrates what I found to be a really interesting way in which faith is being converged and intertwined with a lot of the social happenings that are happening, that are occurring in our present day society, and the way that youth are engaging in both faith and protest and or politics at the same time. And I want to highlight one aspect of this article. So it goes on to talk about different young people of different religious traditions and their sentiments regarding feeling a sense of connectedness, a sense of spiritual preservation when they participate in these protests. And in one section towards the end, it talks about somebody who was part of an interfaith group who participated in a Buddhist for Black Lives March. And this quote is part of that discussion from that individual. And he says, "When I see that entire world marching with me to fight for the rights of others, I feel I am in prayer. When we shut down systems of oppression together, acknowledging our differences for a common cause, that's when I know my prayers are being answered." And what I think is really significant about this quote is that young people are also looking for ways in which the suffering that they read about in the Dharma practices and the sutras and Dharma practice that they think deeply about, that is being discussed in the Dharma talks, they see that in very direct ways in their day-to-day, in very direct ways that are no longer dualistically separated from their own personal suffering. And they're, for the most part, seeking ways in which their religious practice is addressing the reality and the validity of the suffering that they're seeing. And so for many young people today, including some young Buddhists, as we'll see, this idea of Buddhism as a way to address not just individual suffering, or this more broad and sometimes abstract feeling of universal suffering, the fact that we will all get sick, we will all die. Many young people are seeing that it must be connected to the everyday suffering that they're seeing in their lives around them, because they feel the very real effects and consequences of that suffering. So finally, I want to turn to an example, a more concrete example of ways that some young Buddhists are thinking about the future of American Buddhism today. And I want to look at the Young Buddhist editorial. And I am a fan, a quiet internet fan of this endeavor. And I wanted to share it as sort of a continuation of looking at primary sources that are written documents of how young people are engaging with each other across sort of wide divides of geography, maybe less so age, but also incorporating, as I mentioned in the discussion break a little bit earlier, some of the same strategies that the young Buddhists employed during 1943 and 1944 to maintain, preserve, and enhance the future of American Buddhism. So I just wanted to read, for those of you who are not familiar with the Young Buddhist Editorial, a little bit about the description from their website. I believe it's rather new, and they describe their intent as to strive to connect Buddhists across the nation, fostering growth and interconnectedness while maintaining an open dialogue in the community. We aim to provide a forum for any and all Buddhist discussion and expression. And right away, what stood out to me was the parallels between the Young Buddhist Editorial and the Jerome Research and Resettlement Home Program, in the ways that it's seeking, the YBE for short, to create a kind of home base and a way to maintain Sangha across, as I mentioned earlier, geographic distance, and not just across the United States, but internationally, for young Buddhists who are interested in some of the issues that they're writing about, or to provide a venue for young Buddhists to express issues that might not be represented yet in the YBE. So in going through some of the postings and the articles, there were three main themes in regards to the topics that stood out the most in perhaps we can think about the narrative of the YBE. I wanted to share some of those three themes that stood out. The first one was identity. So a lot of the posts by the young Buddhists were in regards to some form of identity. And this included, but was not limited to, race. And again, this is that dimension that I say kind of weaves through some of the structural issues and constraints, and perhaps even possible ways of connecting to others that existed with the YBA during 1943 and 1944, that fact of race and racial exclusion. During today's time period, the young Buddhists are interested in it, not just in regards to this notion of being Japanese or Japanese American, but how that's positioned within this broader notion of race within the United States, and how it's positioned and interconnected with other racial groups within the United States. There are also discussions around issues of gender, specifically around pronoun usage, and around this idea of being Buddhist, what it means to be Buddhist, wrapped up, of course, with this identity of being a young person. Another theme that stood out was quite predominantly was this notion of understanding anti-Blackness. So there are quite a number of postings that made reference to Black Lives Matter, police brutality against people of African descent, what anti-Blackness is and how that's different from just this generalized sense of racism. So there's a particular response to the temporal phenomenon of today. And I say temporal because of the ways that mainstream media is starting to finally address the severity and kind of the long duration of these issues, because we all know, in fact, that it's not something that has only happened today, this issue of anti-Blackness, but it's been part of the very cultivation of this idea of American nation through enslavement. So some of the topics discussed under this broader thematic of understanding anti-Blackness included these very Buddhist ideas of suffering and interconnectedness. And you would hear explicitly, you would read explicitly these terms being interwoven with the way that the young Buddhists are trying to understand anti-Blackness and trying to have conversations about it with each other and with people in their broader Sangha, and even with people beyond the Sangha. So it's interesting to note that in this category, there's a really clear interconnection between Dharma practice and trying to use it to understand social issues that are happening today, especially in regards to race. And as I mentioned earlier, how this notion of American Buddhism, American Shin Buddhism expanding in relation / in response to race is now broader than just the condition of Japanese and Japanese American as a racial category, but it's also very much concerned with the larger picture of race in the United States. And then the third thematic that I noticed was Buddhism, and this is quite straightforward for a web portal entitled Young Buddhist Editorial. But what I mean by this, more specifically, are the attempts that are evident in the postings in which the young people are trying to apply the Dharma to today's context, as I mentioned, with the example of understanding anti-Blackness. And they're trying to do that in communication, as I mentioned earlier, with the Sangha, and in regards to communications that are made by Sangha members. So some of the posts, at least one post made reference to Sangha members who might say things like all lives matter, and the impact of that for some of those who are writing on the Young Buddhist Editorial, and how they want to have conversations around the consequences of saying all lives matter. I'm not on Facebook, but sometimes I go on to some of the public Facebook pages, including the Buddhist Churches of America, just to kind of see and maybe torture myself with some of the comments that are on there, and just online in general, I mean. But I've noticed that there is that conversation that this young Buddhist was talking about, conversations and tensions that are wrapped up in those conversations between those who want to have discussions around understanding anti-Blackness and dealing with it in a very forthright way, and those in the Sangha who are adamantly discussing a stance of all lives matter. And what I want to highlight here is that it has a very real impact on young Buddhists, and as at least as we see being expressed through the YBE, a very strong stance that's being cultivated around that. So that's interesting to know, because there is this history that I've been talking about in regards to race and the future of American Buddhism. And I think that it is going to be this conversation around race, anti-Blackness, and then all the other embedded stuff, because it's interconnected, and young people today are seeing it as interconnected in ways that perhaps previous generations haven't. All of this is part and parcel of that path to creating a future American Shin Buddhism. And I wanted to highlight as one of my last examples, and I'm really happy that John Mullins is on the talk, because maybe I could rope him into maybe sharing a little bit about what your experience has been like facilitating this conversation. But I think this series of workshops by the YBE is an excellent example of some of the convergences of those three themes that are being expressed through their writings on the YBE. As I mentioned, the identity, the understanding anti-Blackness, and the Buddhist aspect of it, and how young Buddhists are trying to make sense of this all. So in workshop 3 of this, I think it was a 3-part series, maybe John, you can correct me if I'm wrong, around, yes?
Oh, part 4 is next Saturday.
Oh, great. Okay, so maybe we can do at the end a little plug for part 4 for those of you who might be interested. Workshop 3 was talking about this very topic of a future. And let's talk about a future without suffering. And again, we note this reference to Buddhist ideas of suffering. And so there are ways, the ways of the young Buddhists who are participating in the YBE of engaging with Buddhism, this notion of a future, these external factors that are very much constraining futures for not just young Buddhists, but all people, are related to specific Dharmic principles. So I wanted to highlight a little bit about a little bit of the language and the specificity in regards to how at least Marissa Wong, who was one of the facilitators and a YBE editor, and John, I think we're envisioning framing this conversation. So as you can see, the workshop description discusses that the workshop is organized by the Young Buddhist Editorial and facilitated by AAPI community leaders and members, Asian American Pacific Islander, that is. And the focus of the workshop is education and allowing a safe space for productive conversation to take place. We hope that all questions can be asked and discussed so that we can all grow together to be better allies. Each of the 4 workshops in the series will have a different focus and are designed to be beneficial regardless of attendance to previous sessions or level of personal education. And the 3 topic areas that were being discussed in that workshop were the idea of reparations and what kinds of reparations would be needed to be made for the Black community. So here, once more, that very explicit reference to shaping the future of American Buddhism and perhaps even the future of America within direct conversation to this expanded notion of race. And I mean expanded in regards to how the YBA had to confront issues of race in the past. And then 2, what does defunding or abolishing the police mean? So there are very pragmatic, logistical concerns for how some of the YBA are thinking about the future. And it goes beyond simply trying to fit within the pre-established structures and systems in the United States to really thinking about an idea of rebirthing a new possibility of maybe the impermanence or the needed impermanence of some of the systems and institutions that we're living with now, such as policing, and how we might be able to rebirth another possibility of interacting with each other. And then topic number 3 is how can mutual aid help build a world free of suffering? So once more, we have a reference to this notion of suffering that really seems to be on the forefront of the way that young Buddhists on the YBA are articulating and thinking about the dynamics of the world that they're living in and the types of harm that they're seeing being done to people in their community. And how all of this, I argue, really shapes their understanding of what liberation and a Buddhist regard of freedom might look like. So I wanted to end there. Well, actually, I don't know if Rick is on the call today, but I wanted to end with a quote from him from, I think, a September 2019 issue of the Dharma Will, where he's talking about this notion of being engaged with these factors that the YBE is very much integrating into their conversations of Buddhist practice and into the ways that they're communicating to a broader audience of young Buddhists across the internet. And he links that specifically to the future of Buddhism and youth. And so he says, he, meaning Reverend Stamble, the BCA should be talking about the pressing humanitarian concerns of our society and finding creative ways to be of service to those suffering right in front of our eyes. And he goes on to say, a strong commitment to improvising social ills has attracted many people seeking a new religious home. It also appears to be a magnet attracting and motivating a new millennial generation. And so my argument in conclusion is that when American Buddhist institutions like the BCA integrate the needs that are being expressed by young people, they not only address the social ills that are shaping the world and our contemporary society around us, but in addressing those issues, because they impact the possibility of young people in the future generation to have a livelihood that is safe, that is stable, it then presents the possibilities for these Buddhist institutions to regenerate through this attraction of these young populations to its message and its actions in society. So I want to stop there and kind of widen the conversation and give people a little bit of time to maybe think about some questions they might have or comments they might have. And as you're thinking, I will just go back to the group chat and see if there are any comments or questions that might be able to kind of bring us into a broader discussion. And I see there are a lot of messages on the chat, so I probably won't be able to get through all of them. But feel free to, if there is a question that's already come to mind, to unmute yourselves and ask that so we can start a conversation. And again, I don't see myself as the person fielding these questions. I would rather this be a conversation with all of us. And I really do want to highlight perspectives from young people as well.
Hello, Professor. I had a question.
Yes.
My name is Patrick Naranjo, and I typically attend Gardena Buddhist Church in Gardena, California, which is at Funie Hsu. But my question is, what do you see as the role or the potential of Buddhist evangelism in the form of like engaged Buddhism in the future of American Buddhism?
I think that question can go in many different ways. And in so much that engaged Buddhism could be addressing in explicit ways some of the concerns that we're seeing expressed by young Buddhists. And again, here I'm taking the YBE as an example and kind of as a way to amplify some of the sentiments that are being expressed by young Buddhists. And they definitely don't represent all young Buddhists. But in the way that engaged Buddhism speaks directly to some of those issues, I could see it being very attractive to more and more young people. And especially in regards to the ways that it might demonstrate physical responsiveness to some of the things that are going on. Some of the tactics by some of the popular engaged Buddhist groups involve direct action. And I think those are more visible ways of seeing action that students are drawn to, or not just students, but young people could be drawn to, especially because it's very visible on social media. So there could be an attraction to investigate or associate with engaged Buddhist groups. Speaking as somebody that used to be a board member of an engaged Buddhist group, I would say that one of the ways that engaged Buddhist groups can think about meeting this kind of engagement with young people or adult Buddhists, or not that young people aren't necessarily adults, but with Buddhists in general and a wider community, is to think about the limitations that the Marxist leftist framework might present in conceiving of what engaged Buddhism means. Oftentimes, and I'm speaking specifically within the American context, engaged Buddhist frameworks are situated very closely with sort of radical leftist politics and strategies, which I find to be effective in many ways. But if it's an engaged Buddhist group, I think that there can be openings, and there should be openings for ways that the Buddhist component can really help to re-envision what that engagement looks like, so that it goes beyond what we're used to in the United States in regards to action and activism, which is that kind of leftist framework from the 60s. And again, I'm somebody who was on a board of engaged Buddhists, or on a board of a nonprofit engaged Buddhist organization, and very much identify with some of those tactics. So I am not poo-pooing it. I'm pointing out ways that it can grow, and ways that American Buddhism can grow in general, American Buddhisms can grow in general with that consideration, and how young people can participate more broadly and show up as Buddhists within that kind of a framework.
Thank you for your response, Professor.
Thanks for your question. See a question from Michael Jones. Okay, so this is a comment where Michael is agreeing with Reverend Kobata. And this goes back to that conversation, I think, again, earlier about within the institution of the Buddhist Churches of America, that generational aspect of transitioning leadership. And so Michael's talking about his concerns since he was a YBA advisor in the 90s and early 2000s, when he could find no interest in the BCA conference to put energy into the continuation of the WYBL. The lack of participation of our youth ages 16 to 30 poses a much greater existential threat. Is this common to all organized religions or just American Buddhism? I think that this is something that a lot of organized religious institutions in the United States are facing, that it's not just a distinctively American Buddhist issue. And again, some of the reports from the Pew Research Center are pointing to this fact that more and more young people are moving away from religion in the United States. And of course, it's different when you break it up by different groups, but it's a concern for many religious institutions, what's happening with young people moving away from religious affiliation.
I have a question.
Yes.
Were the young people back during the camp days running into issues that the young people and, in fact, other people, the Sangha, were running into with the board members? You know, they're kind of like stuck in their ways. If you don't think the way they do, your voices weren't heard. Did they encounter that back then in those days, or were they able to raise their voice and be heard and make a difference?
That's a really great question. So in Duncan Williams's book, American Sutra, he talks about that transition between that kind of coincided with the renaming of the organization to the Buddhist Churches of America, and the Nisei taking over the leadership, and how there was tension between the Issei and the Nisei. And because the Nisei were situated legally within a position of having citizenship rights, they were imbued with a sense of power and a sort of type of privileged position within the Buddhist Churches of America, so that their visions for how they wanted the immediate future of the institution really sort of took over. And the input of the Issei, though it was taken into consideration, I think it's safe to say that was kind of set aside in relation to what the young Buddhists at that time felt like were the needs. So we might think about it as a little bit of an opposite situation from what we might see today, because we don't have that racially inflected sort of institutional exclusion that would prioritize the privilege and the power of the Nisei, because they were American born, so American citizens, and they could do things like take on leases and ownership of property and ownership, or putting titles like the churches under their names.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me? This is Sydney. Thank you so much, Dr. Hsu, for your talk. And I really appreciate especially bringing up some points about young people and maybe our resistance to joining religious institutions. And I definitely see that as something that my peers like echo as well, that sentiment. And so just to clarify, like I'm in my late 20s, and I think that there's, even as I was growing up, or even now, this kind of like resistance to say that I go to church, or to explain that like I'm part of like a part of a temple, and like really trying to kind of have to, I guess, like I find myself at least not being able to kind of explain that, because there is a sort of stigma against like institutionalized religion that I've experienced with my friends. And so I do agree with that point. And I think that there's also kind of this, like within BCA, a little bit of this assumption that younger people aren't as interested or engaged with Buddhism. And I think that is not so true. And, you know, along with YBE, there are a lot of programming that young adults are involved with. And so I just kind of want to like throw this out there too, because I'm not sure that a lot of people on this call are so familiar with those things. And so one of them is the Young Adult Buddhist Association. It's kind of been like maybe not as active for a long time, but recently we've been trying to have more events. And we had an event this May 2019. The focus was on mental health in Buddhism. And we got like, I think it was around 40 people that attended in person in San Mateo, as well as the Techno-Buddha conference that happens every year at the Funie Hsu Center. It was unfortunately canceled because it was supposed to be in March, but you know, the topic of that was Vision 2020. We were going to have Rick Stamble as our keynote, and all the workshops were going to be about social justice and those kind of topics. And it's really interesting because at the time of planning, we were like, oh, this is going to be really, you know, controversial, but now it just seems like more relevant than ever. And, you know, there are groups of us who do attend different conferences, like the Northwest Convention. And so, you know, it's really interesting that there is a lot of this. There's just maybe not as much, you know, like we kind of, I think, are engaging in different ways than what was expected before in previous generations. So, yeah, sorry to put that up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sydney, for sharing your perspectives and for sharing some of the different ways that young Buddhists can be engaged through Techno-Buddha and et cetera, et cetera. And I think too, organizationally, that with every organization, there's always kind of a conversation that's had about how to integrate different aspects of the organization so that there's more communication, perhaps even, to use a very common term within organizational studies, but this synergistic relationship between different groups. And so I can see that conversation that I know is already being had within the BCA in regards to enhancing the awareness and communication between the activities of the young people through YBA or Techno-Buddha and some of the activities that are more considered like the mainstream components of temple services and temple activities. Any other comments or questions in person? I'm going to continue to scroll through the chat to see what I might be able to pick up.
Oh, Doctor, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. George Thal here. Thank you very much for this presentation. I think you touched on a lot of very, very relevant matters. I appreciate that very much. I'm 72 years old now. I go back to the 1960s. I remember the activism of that time about the Vietnam War and the racial issues of that age and everything else like that. And I have a concern. I have a concern about the activism of today, that it may be falling apart on the same thing that made activism fall apart in the 1960s, in my opinion, and that is this utopian idea that if we have one more march or if we do one more occupation, then the whole paradigm is just going to change. And as a committed follower of Shin Buddhism, I know that life isn't like that. What are your thoughts and perspectives about that sort of thing? Like I said, I saw this play out in the 60s. I can see it playing out now. And I'm just hoping that, again, people will recognize that process is what life is all about. It's not going to be an event.
Thank you for that comment and for sharing your experience. I think it's a lot to consider. And parts of your comment and your question make me think back to what I was saying earlier about the form of Buddhism, engaged Buddhism, that's seen as the more explicitly active in regards to participating in social actions, and how conversations about process and conversations about strategy and how maybe just another march might not suffice really can be enhanced by ways that we can think more deeply about integration of the Dharma into these sorts of practices. And I think that being able to cultivate a strong foundation of Buddhist understanding and affinity within young people can be a crucial foundation for continuing this sort of conversation. It makes me also think back to one of the primary sources that I saw when I was going through the Busei bulletins and newsletters from 1943, 1944. And I believe it was Manabu Fukuda again, who was saying that what is essential, the very first step that needs to happen in envisioning this forward progression of American Shin Buddhism is a strong foundation in faith. And I think that strong foundation in faith is not just one where people can recite the sutra by heart, but rather one in which they're thinking expansively about what some of these concepts like suffering, like we see the YBE engaging, and interconnectedness look like in our present day realities, to think beyond simply seeing the solution being in yet another march or yet another protest.
Thank you.
And I'm curious to hear if anybody else has any thoughts about that. As I mentioned, it would be really lovely to see this expand into more of a conversation, because I don't see myself as the expert.
Since the topic is the future of American Buddhism, I think the main practical problem with the future of American Buddhism is that the BCA is the only scene that I know of, is the only Buddhist organization that I know of that has managed to make the transition from the first generation to the second, let alone subsequent generations. Most American Buddhists today are first generation Asian immigrants from Asia, and I know because I've had a few contacts with them, and I've read that they're most of them are not being very successful at all at making the cultural transition to their own children, and and as for the convert scenes, mostly Tibetan Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, that I was involved in Tibetan Buddhism for a while myself. Somehow they don't even seem to try to teach Buddhism to their own children. I think the BCA has a lot to contribute there.
I'm not as familiar with the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, but I can speak a little bit to some of the Taiwanese traditions, because that's the tradition of my family. And I think that in regards to transitioning the leadership, one of the things that complicates it is the difference between kind of a lay leadership and a monastic leadership. And I think that for a lot of the Taiwanese traditions, because it is a monastic tradition, a lot of the organizational structure stays within the ordained Sangha. And I think that presents a whole set of other challenges. But I do see in some of the dominant, the major organizations that have come out of Taiwan and established themselves in the United States, that they have quite strong youth groups and Dharma schools for young people as well, and that there is a generation that is coming up through those systems as well. I don't know necessarily that we can say that they will be transitioned into leadership in the same way as the BCA because of the difference in the organizational structure, but I do see very active engagement with young people in that tradition. But again, within this larger framework of just in regards to American religions in general, young people are leaving, and it's not so much necessarily that they're going to other religions, but they seem to be living religion in general.
I think Reverend Kobata had something that we were going to go back to. Reverend Kobata, are you still there? Did you have a question? I don't see him.
Yeah, I've been chatting.
Oh, yes.
Just randomly. I don't know. Well, the question, yeah, is, I don't know if you saw that article by Melvin MacLeod a few years ago about how Buddhism is for the spiritual but not religious. And so I see there's a lot of potential of following that kind of perspective. You know, that's because, you know, when we say young people aren't religious, I think it's generally we recognize that's in reference to organized religion.
Right.
And so that's why they have that feeling, you know, they do have, any human being has some sense of spirituality, I would guess. And when it gets too organized in the institutional form is where it kind of becomes a distraction. So the young people, who do have, just like we did growing up, or still have, you know, a spiritual sense of life. And so this is how Buddhism can engage that. And so this is where, you know, it's a dilemma for us in the so-called responsible roles with the institution. But we need to, maybe that's radical honesty. To recognize, you know, the institution is valuable if utilized appropriately, but at the same time, it could end up becoming a distraction. You know that metaphor of a cylinder that is placed around a candle to protect the light, but then if you don't pay attention, the soot begins to develop and block out the light. And so that's, you know, the institution. It was intended to preserve and protect that light, but at the same time, it could become the source of blockage to others or younger generations. So I think that's the challenge as institutional leaders of how to maintain that light, the spirit of it, and then not get into the forms, which sometimes we see happening, you know, when you start emphasizing more in that area of the form of it versus, you know, what is the spirit of it? And spiritually, I think it is engagement. And, you know, I don't see engagement as being a single event. It's you know, it is a process. And that's what I think we have the opportunity to commit to, the process of transformation, you know, both personally and collectively. I mean, that's the idea of the Sangha. So just, you know, taking basically the three refuges, you know, taking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, I mean, that kind of offers the direction. But when you put too much emphasis on Sangha as an institutional form, I think something's being neglected and lost, and the younger generations, you know, begin to feel that. And this is what, you know, we need to make that transition.
Yeah, Sensei, when I look at your comment about the spirituality versus the religiosity, and then combine that with what the quote that Dr. Hsu had from Rick Stamble about, you know, getting involved, getting engaged, and so on, and then think about Sydney's comments about how the youth are approaching, today's youth are approaching things. If you sort of wrap all that together and start to envelop, one of our issues is, do we bring the people in to talk to them about the religion, or do we bring the people in to talk to them about how to improve their lives? Well, as I was getting into the position of actually delivering Dharma messages, I got a lot of input from Sangha members, both at San Jose and through my daughter-in-law's family in Southern California. And they said, I honestly don't want to hear about academic Buddhism. I want to know how to use it to live my life, right? How to be a better person. And I think that might be part of the message here. Is I think the younger folks are looking for a way of life, a way to make an impact, a way to change things. I don't think they're looking at the next march as being an event that'll change everything. I think they're looking at the event of change, or the process of changing people's minds to start paying attention to things and sort of thinking about how we have to change our society, how we have to change the perception and the actions of our society for long-term benefit. It's not about stopping a war or stopping this in this city. It's about getting a different perspective and changing the way we approach things in general. I think if you put it all together, it starts to make a lot of sense. How? That's the next challenge.
But I do feel that, you know, being involved entails a physical engagement. I mean, we could write out the greatest statements, you know, ever read, perhaps, but the physical presence as allies, you know, or we, you know, the other popular term in solidarity, you know, oneness, and just talking about it or writing about it versus physically being visibly engaged and participating together with others from various backgrounds, I think is a statement. But anyway, good luck.
And I was, oh, go ahead, Sydney. Go ahead, Sydney.
So yeah, I think Michael's point about like kind of the applicability, I think, of Buddhist teachings is we do kind of, I think, crave. And so, you know, kind of being able to go to church and listen to a talk that is directly relevant and applicable to our lives in the moment, I think is at least to me, has always been like very valuable. And I think that, you know, it doesn't mean that we don't want to learn about Buddhism. I think that's very like, that's sometimes an assumption, but rather like really kind of connecting the dots and having and being able to kind of make a lot of these parallels to our own lives. And I think that there was one question in the comments about how BCA can be more supportive to our work and projects. And, you know, I think that like, it's interesting to me, at least, that, you know, like in this topic, like in this particular webinar, that there might not be a lot of like young people, or, I mean, I don't know exactly, but like, I don't think there's anyone from like YBE besides, I think John Mullins is involved, but I don't, like the main organizers, I don't think are here. And so I'm just kind of wondering like why that is, and like why, like where are those people in this particular conversation? Because I do think that there's a lot of talk about like young people and like what we want, but then sometimes that like either we don't have the space in these conversations, or we're not present in them. And so I think that's just an interesting thing. And I do have other thoughts about the how BCA can be more supportive, but I don't want to necessarily address all of those right now. Maybe John can help me in a minute. But especially like kind of thinking about these programs that I find really interesting, but I think are not maybe marketed to certain age groups in a way that they could be.
So Sydney, can I piggyback on some of the points you made and ask, how was it that you got interested in attending today's talk? Because I wonder if that might serve as a way to think about some of the practical matters of how BCA might be able to kind of make more integrated these different strands of what's going on with the YBA and the YBE and things like that.
Yeah. How did I get? I think because I know Judy personally, like I'm one of the Techno Buddha chairs for this past year, and I don't exactly even really know if it was an email or I think because I saw Professor Scott Mitchell was one of our workshop leaders, and so I was interested in hearing him speak, and so then I was like, oh, I might as well just sign up for both of them. But I do think it was like kind of a just happened to be an email, and I was like kind of curious. So I did have a kind of a connection, personal connection that then led me here. And I think if there were, yeah, I think that's a challenge. Like that's always a challenge within even our, like even getting the word out for our events too. It's like some people now are not on Facebook. Like that's not something that I think millennials are as active on. Now it's kind of more Instagram, but it totally depends. Like even people that are just a few years younger than me have a whole other way of kind of, communicating. But I think that yeah, there is kind of a, I feel like a challenge with publicity, visibility, and just awareness of what's going on that somehow is lost. I don't know. John, do you have any other comments on that?
About what?
About
Communications? Or, okay, gosh, I have a lot, but I don't want to take up too much space here. This was a really, really wonderful talk. I really appreciate it. The presentation, I think, hit on so many points in itself, that I think young people are concerned about, and the reason I can just speak to my own involvement with YBE is because I'm totally inspired by the questions they're asking and the approaches they're taking. You talked about, I think it was one of the earliest references in the presentation, kind of this toolbox, like what are the tools that we're developing to address the issues of today, our own understanding, and I think maybe one way to look at it is, these workshops and this presentation and these formats are kind of tools that we know, that we're familiar with, that CBE has developed, that have been here, and maybe young Buddhist, or at least YBE, is sort of growing their own set of tools, based on how they were educated, how they grew up, what their experiences were, and they're trying to apply their kind of tools to these questions as well. And so I don't think that there's necessarily like a conflict. It's just that maybe it's like, in order to support each other, we need to sort of be open to looking into each other's toolboxes, to seeing how we talk about things, and to hopefully learning and growing from each other. I'm involved just so I can learn, I know I presented, but that's why I'm there. And so I think what they might be looking for is that kind of openness as well, that kind of appreciation as well. Sometimes questions toward young people are framed as, how can the young people help us? Or how can we pass down our exact toolbox to them so they can utilize it exactly the way that we did? And I think maybe the conversation should be different. So that's the best I can offer. And I already took way longer than I meant to. Sorry. Thanks.
Can I say something? It's Elsie. I don't have a picture. I don't want to turn myself on, but I'm the one that asked Sydney about how BCA could help. And I'm from Berkeley, Higashi Honganji, and I really, I haven't been active for that long, but from what I'm seeing from the outside in, I I just think we don't have agreement on a common vision and a common goal for the future of Buddhism in America. I think it's so, I go to, I attend the online service and the chanting's on Japanese and it's a religious message. And then I look at, there's this variation all over the country of different, different messages, different Dharma messages. But I think in my own kids who are in their 20s and 30s, somebody said it earlier, right? Interested in the quality of life and how does Buddhism impact my everyday life, how I raise my children, I have 2 grandchildren. So it's always like we felt, I don't know, we lost our relevance. But before we even know how to do this, we have to know what we want to do. And I think that we have to involve people like Sydney in answering that question. What is it for all the generations is important? And then we decide what's the best way given the situation and the conditions out here, cause and conditions as to what we can do. That's sort of, anyway, in short, my opinion. Did I just stun everybody?
Judy, I wanted to make a comment on the chats, just generally, because we have so many comments and they're all really good questions. And we probably don't have time to go into it, but just commenting on it, I thought that, as a CBE staff person helping to plan this, it seems like there's a lot of future workshops or collaborations, with YBE or whatever, but there seems to be, there's a lot of questions on different generations, experiences, questions, lessons, from not just the Nisei, but the Sansei. Reverend Hirano has a whole, kind of a whole presentation on what the Sansei's contributions and experience was in building the BCA that we know today, probably. And we haven't really touched upon that. And then, of course, all of the youth activity and other Sangha experiences with engagement in our society. So I, thank you, Funie, for such a nice, broad, framework, I think, for us to look at. And I'm just going to say personally that I think it's very useful and very encouraging to hear that the youth of the 1950s or 1945 and 44 were Dharma driven. And, we are thankful for that energy and that dedication, that they put into building what we can enjoy as BCA today. And I think it's very encouraging to hear that the youth of the younger generations today are using some of the same Dharma-driven, Dharma-centered strategies that you talked about, and organizing and reaching out and taking the initiative, taking responsibility for making sure that Buddhism in some form is going to be part of our lives in the future. So I think that's a very useful, very optimistic kind of takeaway for me, and that we need to find new ways of having intergenerational discussions like this. And so I think that's an open question for CBE and for YBE and each of you, as from whatever point of involvement you are at, as with BCA or as Buddhists, to make those suggestions. This whole seminar online is a huge experiment for CBE, and it's been great because we can invite anybody to come and participate. And so this is kind of an expansion of that invitation to help us keep developing the content of the discussion. So I didn't mean to say too much, but I was going to try and read all the chats, but of course people can see that too. But it's too bad, Funie, I think you can see them too. So please respond to anything there that you feel is most useful right now. We didn't actually plan this youth focus, which is great, and it makes so much sense, and it's something that I think everybody is interested in hearing. And I think I see that some of the barriers, at least we have identified, at least in some conversation, is the institutional barriers, organizational barriers, and also our own perception of how closely we want to be affiliated with an organized religion in this day and age. So those are many barriers, or factors for us to be, aware of. But I think that this is an open space, for pursuing all those questions. And so I really thank all of the people commenting, and especially you, Funie, Dr. Funie Hsu. And I'm kind of making a little closing, driving into a little closing, because it's 10 to 1. And usually we try to start winding up the discussion and invite people, if the speaker is available, to hang out later.
Or we could also give is it okay to give your email to people?
Sure, yeah.
If they have other questions. Yeah.
And before that, though, we do have closing gasho, and I wanted to ask Funie if you have some closing comments or whatever, anything that you would like to close with, having gone through, some of this discussion, to just leave it to you to add some parting thoughts for us.
Thank you. Yeah, I do have two things that are on my mind, and some of them kind of gelled as I was listening to this conversation, which I'm really appreciative for. So thank you for everybody who participated on in person and in the chat. But one of the things that I wanted to say kind of aligns with one of the points you made, Yumi, about how for myself, reading some of these primary source documents, I found them to be incredibly inspiring. And I remember thinking, I wonder if the young Buddhists today have read some of this stuff, if they have access, if they know what the previous generation of young people did for Buddhism. And if so, I wonder how that might impact them and shape their work. And if not, I wonder how maybe that can happen. And I know I keep talking about Duncan's work because I think it is such an important, significant contribution to American Buddhism. I mean, I think that's a start for kind of bridging that gap between the history and knowing what's happened and what people did to preserve American Shin Buddhism. But I think there's incredible potential and on my part, personal excitement around the fact that the Buddhist Churches of America archive is now at UCLA. And I think they were in the process of opening that up to the public before the pandemic hit. But maybe in the future, there might be some kind of potential for YBE or young Buddhists to take a field trip there and go through some of the archives and look at some of the work that young Buddhists did in previous decades. I think that could be really fruitful and meaningful. And then the last comment that I had is for the young people, maybe it's only Sydney on this call, but I'm curious, when you hear this idea of a conversation about thinking of American Buddhism, do you feel like you are allowed to have a stake in that? Do you feel like people are talking to you? Do you feel like the future of American Buddhism necessarily incorporates you? And I think if young people don't feel like it does, and that's a very telling sign of some changes that might need to happen. So I just wanted to end there. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're very appreciative. It was very interesting. And I think it's nice that Sydney, you were here, because now we got you here. She can help spread the word to other young people about our different programs that we have too. And I think you gave her some ideas of what they might want to even do themselves too. Yeah, I think it's really turning out great. So let's have Reverend Hirano. We'll close right now. Sensei, are you ready?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hsu. It was a very enlightening talk. Hopefully, many of you will join us again for our next talk. Will be Reverend Ken Yamada. He'll be speaking of Nishi and Higashi and its development, because that also developed differently here in the U.S. And so that will be, we'll check the BCA website and you'll see all the upcoming talks that CBE will be having. Hopefully you'll join us. We have quite a few people joining us on a regular basis, but just so that you could get the link. All right, so I'd like to close at this time with Gasho, please. Namo Amida Butsu.
Namo Namanda 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 Namanda